This is a reading of the short story Allegory by Christian Swanson. This is Christian Swanson speaking. Enjoy.
Those demons, if you will.
A little person,
And the way we're going to do
one person in a sea of many little people
we're just going to aim our
who
power
are
tool right
not
there.
aware of me. I do my little job and live my little life, eat my little meals, miss my little kid and wife, and somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away, I'll find a second little person who will look at me and say, I know you, you're the one I've waited for. Let's have some fun. Life is precious, every minute, and more precious with you in it. So let's have some fun. We'll take a road trip way out west. You're the one I like the best. I'm glad I found you, like hanging round you. You're the one I like the best. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away. Somewhere, maybe someday, maybe somewhere far away, I'll meet a second little person, and we'll go out and play.
Let me tell you a story, all right? Okay, about 2 months ago, I moved to Seattle, yeah? And I'm a wreck. The last doctor I went to gave me Serazone. She thought I was depressed. It's the equivalent of checking the tire pressure on a car that's on fire. Stop. Hold on. Let me finish. I'm getting sidetracked. I try a few different places around here. I don't tell them about my problem. I tell them everything except for that. None of them respond well. Too impersonal, too methodical, too perfect, proper, professional. I need more than a shrink. I need a friend. I need someone I can call at 10 to go get a drink with. Not literally, figuratively, maintaining the doc-patient relationship, you know. But I need someone I can consider my friend and someone who won't cut me off mid-sentence to tell me that my appointment time is up. I know it's selfish, I know, I get that, but it's what I need. So I come to this one guy, right? And it's finally turning around. He's a Jewish-looking guy, kind of hefty. His name's Gordon. Gordon makes me feel at ease. He tells jokes, makes me laugh. He's self-deprecating and he pokes fun at himself. Even poked a little fun at me during some of my stories. I could roll with it. That was cool. I'm thinking about making an appointment with him. Another one, I mean. Well, then he tells me a story. There's one girl, he tells me, that he saw a while back. She comes in and tells him that she's hearing voices in her head, right? And hallucinating. She's seeing Hitler, as in Adolf German Jew hate Hitler. And he's telling her violent things, kill yourself, cut your wrists, break that, destroy the house, burn it to the ground, that type of stuff. And she's freaked out by this. Now, the kill yourself line is what gets Gordon nervous. You can't take that kind of stuff lightly, So he asks her if she would ever actually consider doing something like that. Junkie Girl looks at him like he's crazy and says, "No, I wouldn't listen to Hitler." And when Gordon hit the ending of that story, oh, boy, did he laugh. He cackled. He couldn't get enough of it. Now, let me ask you this. Gordon laughs at a story like that. He gets a kick out of that and tells it to the other people. What the hell do you think he's going to do with one of my stories? What's going to be his reaction to me telling him that I see things? Is it going to be just as funny to him? Is he going to be laughing with his friends behind my back? What was he trying to pull that entire time? Was that ever...
Sir! A voice across the black wooden countertop and bulletproof glass interrupted the man, who flinched at the sudden sound of a voice that wasn't his own. He quickly pocketed the metallic-looking cube he held in his hand and stepped forward.
I called earlier.
He paused briefly, hoping she would remember his phone call. Her slight, annoyed glance upward indicated that she hadn't. He placed the numerous pieces of paperwork required for the name change on the counter, sliding it through the slit at the bottom so she could reach them. The woman glanced over the pages in front of her and nodded. "Okay," she said without much excitement, having done this multiple times before in her tenure. "There'll be a $65 surcharge, and the change will be published in the local paper. So you understand these terms?"
Yeah,
the man replied, fishing through his pocket for the check he had written before he had left for the courthouse. Finding it, he slipped it onto the counter, and within a few moments, he was out the door, heading straight for his car. The newly created Gerard McVicker's name would still be published in whatever local gazette the court chose, but it mattered little to him at this point, as he was leaving the area as soon as he reached his vehicle. Gerard, being on the heavy side, walked at a slow gait, but his large strides made up for the pace. He reached his car within 2 minutes. It was already set to go. His clothes were all organized in neat piles in individual plastic bags in the very back, while the bulk of the van's trunk was occupied by bedding. In the passenger seat sat a toolbox filled with everything he needed for work at the construction site in Calville. There was a seat belt wrapped tightly around it to prevent it from moving whenever Gerard hit the brake. In between the passenger and driver's seat was a large box of wholesale air fresheners, a decent amount of them still left unopened. The van felt far too hot, and Gerard was hungry. He couldn't recall eating that day, though he was sure he had. A few hours passed by. The van was cranking along Interstate 90, heading east through Washington with the goal of making it to Calville. The union had set him up there. They were surprisingly understanding when it came to his need to change locations frequently. As long as he didn't get into any large amount of trouble, there was always some kind of position they could fit him with. He'd been in construction for nearly 20 years now with little incident, so there was that, too. The sun was out of sight now, blocked by the imposing mountaintops that surrounded the road on both sides. He still had 14 miles to go until the next rest stop, its facilities marked only by a picture of a bed and a picture of a knife and fork crossed together in the stereotypical food sign. That's where he would stop. As much as he didn't like to admit it, he found himself growing tired of his constant push forward, barely giving himself a chance to catch a breath. The road around him was completely empty except for his van. He was going to be on Interstate 90 for almost 200 miles. 200 miles of nothing but Washington wilderness. Lightless, soundless, and empty. The only two sources of light came from his own vehicle and the moon. Coming from a place like Seattle, he felt a slight tingle of self-loathing at his inability to have foreseen this large difference. It took him out of his comfort zone, beyond the equilibrium which he generally worked so hard to maintain. Multiple air fresheners hung from the rear-view mirror in the van, all of them the same scent, pine. It was the same thing he'd always chosen, never bothering to take the older ones out. Ever since he'd moved to Washington, he'd begun to grow sick of the smell, but was far too gone to make such a drastic change at this point. The air fresheners were important. While he knew for the majority of his adult life that he hadn't exactly been normal, Gerard had come to accept certain aspects of the way he both functioned and experienced the sensory data around him. Smell was damn near the second most important thing to him. It reminded him of his location. Where was he? In Washington. The smell of pine resonated through the moving hunk of metal. Not just pine. Western hemlock, the state tree of Washington, found on the Pacific coast of the United States. It needs the rich, non-acidic soil and moist climate combination that you can only find there. Nowhere else. It was a recognizable anchor that weighed him down to this moment in history, the very instant in the universe that his current state of consciousness existed in. Gerard's entire body was blasted back in a sudden burst of force against the driver's seat. Speed bump. Just a speed bump. Gerard squeezed his eyes shut in a feat of self-chastising. He wasn't paying enough attention, which was definitely a problem. He wasn't particularly tired, so falling asleep at the wheel wasn't likely, but getting into an accident was the last thing he needed. He glanced down at the radio. 10:42 p.m. It ticked over to 10:43 just as he glanced. Gripping the steering wheel a bit more tight, he stared ahead of him, focusing on the upcoming road signs. The road wound around a curve in the mountains before continuing in the same way it had been going. As Gerard turned the car along this small blind spot, he found himself concentrating on the sound of his own breathing. In and out. In and out. In and out. He felt his body jump backwards again. The suspension in the car rattled slightly. Another one. He grit his teeth, muttering under his breath. Why hadn't he seen the sign? Glancing in the rearview mirror, he did indeed see the neon orange glow of the speed bump warning glowing a few yards behind his car. It didn't help that the road immediately following the bump twisted around a curve in the mountain before continuing in the same way it had been going. Upon this thought, he felt something stir within his stomach, but pushed it away, rationalizing it to be nerves. The sound of his own breathing was another constant, along with the air fresheners, that he not so much enjoyed, but relied upon. He never turned the radio on, regardless of how long the drive was. He hated the noise of static. It was like nails on a chalkboard. The crackling, indistinct pattern of randomized tones gave him a headache. He couldn't make sense of the noise whenever he encountered it. It was like audible chaos. Constant, energetic, unstopping, and yet totally ubiquitous when the noise was present. It drowned out everything else around him. Just thinking about it made him cringe. In doing so, he felt another sensation as he closed his eyes. For the third time, he felt his weight thrown against the back of the seat. It sincerely shocked him this time, and he heard himself let out a small yelp. He blinked a few times and lightly hit the brake pedal, slowing down slightly. He definitely had not seen a warning sign that time. A few moments passed by before his slight confusion morphed into a growing sheet of ice in his stomach as he saw the winding curve in front of him, rounding around the mountain before going in the direction it had been heading. He felt his heart rate quicken and tried to stem the overwhelming creep at the icy pitch in his stomach. The time. He needed to check the time. Glancing down at the radio, it read out 10:42 p.m., switching over to 10:43 as he blinked. This had never happened to him on the road before. The snapback would be beyond dangerous. It would be unpredictable. There was no one on the road now, but there's no telling who would be there later.
What's happening? Where are we?
A high-pitched, panicked whine came from somewhere next to Gerard. He focused forward and held his breath, ignoring the intrusion, hoping to have some effect on the road ahead of him. Nothing. He blinked, and in the split second of opening his eyes, found himself going back over a speed bump, being thrown against the driver's seat, and saw the neon paint of the sign in the rearview mirror. The time ticked over to 10:43. The heavy, confused breaths coming from the passenger's seat grew more labored, breaking out into a wheeze. Gerard tensed up. He stared into what he could make out of the horizon in the distance. That was where he needed to get. It was 10:43. His name was Gerard McVicker. He was driving to Calville, Washington to take place in a construction project for the expansion of the community. He was driving there. He was in the process of driving there. It was dark outside. His eyes scanned around for some other recognizable object to anchor him to his location.
Where am I? Hello? Hello? Is there someone there? What's going on? Where am I? Why can't I see anything? I can't. What do you want? Who are you?
Came the voice from beside him. The shrillness of the voice made him break. He had to stop it. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up, he commanded monotonously. It sounded like a mantra. It overlapped the cries of the noise, but didn't stop it.
I don't know who you are. What do you want from me? What's happening? I can't hear anything. What's going on? Just let me go, please.
The noise was weeping, growing more and more desperate. Shut up. Shut up. Shut up. Stop it. Stop it. You're not real, he shouted, still keeping his eyes on the road. The sound wasn't necessarily new to him, but he'd never encountered it questioning its own existence. The weeping, sobbing, high-pitched groan was growing louder. It seemed to be begging, pleading for whatever it was talking to spare it.
I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I don't want to die.
It began repeating, over and over. The noise was constant. All he wanted was quiet so he could figure his way out. He blinked. Another thud sounded as the car drove over the speed bump. The time was now 10:43, and the noise was growing deafening. Intermingled with the wailing and groaning were desperate pleas for the sparing of its life. With one hand still on the steering wheel, Gerard reached down into the box beside him, grabbing a handful of air fresheners. He raised them up to his mouth and ripped 3 of them open with his teeth, immediately inhaling the musky, damp, artificial scent. It wasn't the smell of a real tree. It was the approximation of various scents that a businessman had somewhere deemed viable enough to smell enough like a pine tree to sell it as such. You could get them anywhere, not just Washington. He could be anywhere right now. The pleading stopped, but the wheezing grew harder. The noise hurt Gerard's ears. He wanted it to stop. All he wanted was for it to stop. He squeezed his eyes shut for a few moments, preparing himself. When he opened them, he stared off into the distance, forcing himself not to close his eyes. Despite this, he could not ignore the noise. He needed to cover it up. As much as he hated doing so, his free hand reached for the knob on the radio. He clicked it in. For one brief second, there was a resounding silence. Nothing. And he could see the horizon getting closer. Knowing that it wasn't the end, he readied himself. All at once, he felt his brain assaulted by the static. It drowned out every other thought he had and left him with nothing but the buzzing of radio noise. Every electronic in the world bounding through the atmosphere, being passed through one receiver. He still hadn't blinked. In frustration, he drew his hand back and punched the side of the car, almost crumpling to the ground and losing his composure, as he found himself stationary, standing in a parking lot. He stared dumbly at the van in front of him for a moment, letting his mind catch up with itself. The noise was gone. The static was gone. He reached for his pocket, finding the keys packed inside of them. Looking up, he saw that the moon still hung high in the sky. This happened. He wasn't used to it, but it happened. He did a slow turn, viewing his surroundings. It was a roadside rest stop, probably the one he had seen the sign for before, though he couldn't be sure. The small parking lot was nestled in a clearing, but still surrounded by the thick western hemlocks on both sides of the property. There were 2 buildings. One was just a pair of restrooms and some vending machines stationed next to a small shelf of tourist pamphlets for the various Washington sideshows, and the other, a bit larger, was what looked to be a diner, lit by a neon sign that stated Molly's in fluorescent pink cursive letters. The lights were on inside. Gerard forced himself to begin walking forward. This, he guessed, was where he was meant to go. The inside of Molly's was clearly not meant for many people besides the over-the-road truck drivers. Paneled wood lined the walls above an irksome green wallpaper that covered the lower half. The floor was covered in a black and white linoleum, not matching the walls that surrounded it. Inside the diner, while a few scattered booths lined the outer wall, the main area of activity was the diner bar that lined the back wall and boxed off into the middle of the room. On the other side of the bar, besides the natural selection of liquor, sat the basic elements of cooking equipment. A chalkboard hung to a nail on the very back wall, a few faded specials still readable on its surface. It really only looked like there were two people working. There was a young man wearing a black button-up shirt carrying food to a table on the other side of the room, and behind the bar stood a middle-aged woman. A kitchen apron hung loosely around her shoulders, chatting to another female who was sitting at the bar. A dingy speaker system piped in some light muzak through the diner. Gerard stood outside the open door for a few moments, contemplating whether or not he should go inside. He disliked eating in public. He would have considered it longer had the middle-aged bartender and cook not called him in from the other side of the building.
"Come on in, sir. You don't have to wait for an invitation," she called.
Her voice was sweet and friendly, but held a throaty grit to it, as though she was a heavy smoker. It was surprisingly comforting to Gerard, who traveled towards the sound of her voice. She continued to speak to him as he traveled to the bar and took a seat next to the other woman.
"Why were you staying out there? You're soaked now."
Soaked? Gerard asked her, tilting his head to the side. Glancing down at himself, he saw what she meant. He was indeed covered in water. And now that it was brought to his attention, he saw that it was raining outside. He hadn't even registered it until now. And with it brought to his attention, he found himself feeling quite cold. He looked at the woman behind the counter, who already had a menu in her hand, outstretched for him. He took it and smiled. Thank you, he added, continuing to look at her as she nodded back. There was a brief pause, as though he were expecting her to say something else to him, but she did not. His thoughts muddled around in his head for a moment, and he leaped to the first thing that came to mind. Are you Molly? He stammered out. She chuckled at the question.
"No, afraid not, sir. My name is Pam. Can I fix you something?"
She let the awkwardness roll off her back like water off a duck. She'd probably seen tons of oddball truckers hopped up on amphetamines cross through the place in however long she'd worked there. Sure, I just need coffee right now. That's all I need, Gerard said. His stomach growled. He truly couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. "Do you like meatloaf?" The woman he'd sat next to asked him. She spoke with a light Midwestern accent. Turning to her, Gerard saw her hands fiddling with a mess of rubber bands, all of which had been bunched together into knots. "Huh?" he asked. The woman looked to be in her mid-30s. She was slightly overweight and had a mess of naturally curled, unkempt black hair running down her neck. It was bound together at the top in what should have been a ponytail, but the frizziness of it prevented it from doing anything but fanning out along her neck and upper back. I just asked because I just ordered some for myself. It'd be easier on Pam, just put two in together," the woman said.
"Maddie,"
Pam said, one of her eyebrows raised.
"Let the man decide for himself. I'm not new at this. I can handle my own. I got a whole menu here."
No, Gerard interrupted, shaking first, then nodding his head. "I'm actually, meatloaf is fine. I really have no preference." "You sure?" Pam asked, turning away from Gerard and setting a percolator onto the open stove behind her.
"It's really no trouble."
"I was going to ask you for a recommendation," Gerard muttered. He looked down at the countertop. Granite. Granite countertops always felt so sturdy. Glancing next to him, he noticed that the woman, apparently named Maddie, had loosened the rubber band tumbleweed and was fastening the loose rubber bands to some kind of wooden carapace. He stared at it for a few seconds, and noticing his interest, she held it up to display it for him. "Do you like it? My son made it for me the last time I was home. I'm an OTR driver, so I'm not home as much as I'd like to be." She stuck the last one onto it, stretching the small band between wooden pegs. "What is it?" Gerard asked. The wooden carapace held a number of outstretched pegs, which she had latched the rubber bands onto, each of the used bands being a different length. "Oh, it's just a little instrument he made for me in his woodshop class. He's in junior high. It's not much, but it makes me think of him whenever I get the chance to stop, whenever I get the chance to stop, whenever I get the chance to stop, whenever I get the chance to stop." Gerard blinked as the jazz music continued uninterrupted in the background. He stared at the instrument for a moment, and then at Pam. "Do you have a restroom here?" he hurriedly asked. Pam nodded happily. Her smile made Gerard feel a bit better. Yep. Well, right next door we do. You'll need to go back out in the rain, but you're already wet, so it won't be too big a deal. Why don't you go do that? Your coffee will be ready by the time you get back," she explained, gesturing over to the percolator beside her. Nodding, he smiled weakly, feeling worried. Gerard quickly stood up and walked back outside into the rain. Feeling the water hit his skin, he was puzzled as to how he hadn't noticed it before. It was freezing. The droplets of water felt like small points of metal hitting his skin as he traveled the 50 feet down the small sidewalk to the pavilion with the bathrooms. He ducked inside as quick as he could, already shivering at the temperature. Inside the bathroom, he pushed the door shut and turned to the mirror, staring at his own reflection for a few seconds. He breathed in and out, centering himself. Reaching into his pocket, he felt the metal cube he always kept with him. He'd found it one day back when he was first starting construction. It seemed to be made out of bismuth due to the way it reflected so many different colors. Holding it carefully in his palm, he raised it to his mouth, staring directly into the eyes of his opposite self as he talked. "Let me tell you a story, all right? Your name is Gerard McVicker. That is who you are. You are not going anywhere. You are in the middle of Washington. That is where you are. You are okay. You have done nothing wrong. You have hurt no one. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You have nothing to fear. You have nothing to run from. There are no problems. You are Gerard McVicker. You are Gerard McVicker. Zup, nya, zim, nya, 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 nya. Gerard watched his reflection making the absurd noises, contorting its face into all sorts of twists and turns and wrinkles. He was angry. He was more than angry. He was furious. He wanted out of his predicament, despite not fully understanding what it is that his predicament actually was. He felt an immense frustration at the sheer helplessness of his situation. He was drowning in the middle of the ocean, yet still grasping into the air for something to save him, as though there would somehow be an exit. Raising his hand back, he smashed the cube into the mirror, only managing to bounce it off pathetically, a small crack in his face left in the wake. His face morphed into a twisted smile which curled upward and immediately downward as he burst into tears. Falling to his knees, he leaned the top of his head on the granite countertop that held the sinks, weeping. The lights in the room flickered, and Gerard quickly glanced upward to confirm that they were. The release of crying comforted him to some extent, and after regaining his composure, he gripped the counter and pulled himself up. He gave one last glance at the mirror and began to say something, but stopped. He put his hands in the sink. The motion-sense faucet detected his hands and began to spray water on them. He brought the handful of water up and splashed it across his face. As he did, though, he stopped, as he could have sworn for a brief second that he heard static. He wiped the water from his eyes. Something wasn't right. He suddenly felt lighter, as though a large weight had suddenly lifted off of his back. As usual, he grimaced at the situation. Everything seemed to have grown quiet. Even the fan that normally rumbled through the room had been silenced. Putting his hands back down into the wash basin, he froze, losing his breath for a moment at the sight. Inside the sink, the water had frozen in midair, Not into ice, but a liquid. A viscous but unmoving liquid, suspended in 5 small streams the faucet had spat out. He put his face closer to the strands of water, reaching his hand out to touch them. As his finger touched the water, the mass parted to make room for the digit. It remained frozen after his movement, bending like modeling clay, and then sticking in the air. He drew his hand back and saw that no water had stuck to it. He reached forward again. As his finger touched the stream, however, a resounding tone rang through the room. A single-toned, continuous noise sounded out in notes. Bang! 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 Gerard's curiosity had been piqued. Brushing off his previous frustration as an annoyance, he found himself slightly fascinated and opened the bathroom door, following the noise. Outside, the rain had also ceased movement. Heavy lines of stationary liquid hung suspended in the air, as though suspended in magnetic lock, brushing aside him as he walked towards the sound of the vibration. Boing! 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 A tunnel formed through the haze, cartoonishly shaped to the exact contours of his body as he pressed onward. The droplets and streams gave little resistance, merely beating off of his jacket and sweeping aside where they would freeze once again. The sound was coming from inside Molly's. Gerard, utterly hopeless but undeniably curious, opened the door to the building, where he felt almost blown back by the utter strength of the sound waves hitting him. They blew a strong gust of wind out the door as though it had been packed inside the diner. Slowly trekking against the current, he found the source of the noise to be coming from where he'd been sitting. So focused on the noise, he hadn't given thought to his surroundings. As he approached, noticing that everyone in the restaurant had become immobile. A cup of coffee had been laid out on a small dish in front of his seat. Pam was bent over in front of her oven, cooking mitts on, putting 2 small loaves of beef into the fire. The waiter, wearing black, was serving a plate of food to a patron, frozen in midair as he sat the serving dish down. Customers around the diner sat frozen in place, some eating food, someone tossing a coin into the air, all of them completely still. Turning his head back to the sound, Gerard noticed Maddie's hands, which still clutched the instrument tightly. It was where the noise was coming from. One of the rubber bands, the largest, most taut one on the instrument, was vibrating, letting out a loud roar. Gerard slowly reached his hand for it. Thwang! 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 You like it? Mr. Bishop asked. He sat across from Gerard behind a plain wooden desk. His desk had a name plaque on it displaying his name and title, the CEO of the local construction company. Gerard was seated. His muscles wobbled and almost gave out, leading him to crumple out of the chair. He regained himself at the last moment, picking his head up to look around the room. The sickly green plush carpet on the ground made him feel ill. Across from him sat the well-to-do James Bishop, a man he had talked to briefly on the phone before starting his drive across Washington. Gerard felt sick to his stomach, and the reflection to himself of how much time must have passed made it even worse. In his hands, he saw what looked like an instrument made out of balsa wood and popsicle sticks, bound together with rubber bands fashioning a crude instrument. He tried to say something, anything, to bring his head out of the blurry muddle that his mind was wrapped up in, but the words failed to make their way out of his mouth. Instead, he merely raised his gaze to the man sitting across from him and tilted his head, as though to ask the object's purpose. Well, it's not much. My son made it for me in school. Each one of the rubber bands produces a different note. Here, let me see. Mr. Bishop offered out his hand, and Gerard complied. Carefully handling the handmade instrument, he set it down on his desktop and fingered the strings for a few seconds, noting where each of the bands were. Selecting a few, he began to pull back and release them, playing a rudimentary version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. "You see?" he asked, looking for a reaction from Gerard, who simply nodded in reply. Mr. Bishop, which site am I going to be working on?" he asked. It was the only question he could think of. He just wanted to move on from trying to understand everything. He wanted to adapt. That's what he had grown used to, right? "Oh, we only have 3 projects going on at the moment, but they're pretty long-term. You must have seen by now on your way here that this isn't a very large town. It's only 2:15 right now, so you still have time to visit each site. We don't have a huge crew here, so we could use you wherever you feel most comfortable." Mr. Bishop's wrinkled face gave off a genuine feeling of warmth, which Gerard appreciated. "Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'll be sure to do that," he replied. As he said this, Mr. Bishop pulled and released one of the rubber bands from the instrument, picking it up into the air. "Let me tell you a story, all right? I like to tell everyone something along these lines when they start to work with us, Gerard. You see this rubber band here? This rubber band represents a lot about the work you'll be doing here. Rubber bands are amazing. They've been around since the 1800s and haven't undergone many changes since then," Bishop explained. Gerard was thankful that the man was undergoing what appeared to be a well-rehearsed monologue, as it gave him the opportunity to collect his own thoughts. Bishop continued. "There are so many uses for the plain, old-fashioned rubber band. Apart from tape, it's the most commonly used non-glue-based binding instrument. Well, think of your stay here as this rubber band, all right?" Bishop placed his fingers on the inside of the band and began to slowly stretch them apart from each other. "Now, I'll be honest. While I understand full well that the starting pay here isn't the best, what is good is that we have a very small local construction team, yes? Now, I know you're a veteran in the business, correct? That's what my contact over in Seattle told me. Well, I could certainly use someone like you for more than just manual labor. So while you're here, think of this finger," nodding towards the finger that was stretching away, "as your future, and this finger," nodding towards the stationary digit, "as your current state. It may seem a bit repetitive, doing the same thing each day on a seemingly never-ending cycle, but eventually, once our current projects get done, and once I see that you do what you've been instructed," he curled his lower finger, shooting the rubber band across the room. It hit the cheap, stackable wood paneling that Bishop lined the walls with. Bishop chuckled. "Well, you'll just shoot forward and catch up with everything you've been missing." Gerard forced a smile, but Bishop's entire speech made him nauseous. He held his hand out to the businessman. Thank you," he said. Bishop shook his hand, smirking at Gerard's demeanor. "You're a man of few words, Gerard," he said, taking a sip from a glass of mineral water on his desk. "I can appreciate that. You came highly recommended. I just want to see that your reputation holds true. Then we can talk about something more permanent, yeah? I was told that you're a good, fast, careful worker, and that you have a knack for catching errors." I just like the work. It helps take my mind off of things," Gerard said, telling the truth. He stood up. He wanted to get to a private place as soon as possible. "It's been nice talking to you." "And you the same, Mr. McVicker. I hope to hear great things from you. You can pick up the locations of the sites from my secretary. I'll have her write them down for you." "All right. Have a good day," Gerard said, heading out the door. As he closed the door behind him, he was struck with a unique sense of vertigo, having no real idea where he was or where his car was located. Next to the door, a young woman with short, brown hair was already holding out a piece of paper with a list of addresses on them. "Here you are, Mr. McVicker. Do you need your directions to any of them?" Gerard took the paper, but didn't bother reading it, folding it up and jamming it into his pocket. "No, I'm fine. Is there a restroom here?" he asked with a slight bit of urgency. Yeah? the secretary said, a bit off-put by Gerard's suddenness. "It's actually on the bottom floor, in the basement. You can take the elevator right there. First door on your left once you get off." She pointed directly behind him. Gerard quickly turned and peeled off in the direction of the elevator, which was located at the end of the hall, already opened and waiting. Getting in, Gerard hammered down the B button and felt the lift jerk downward. Assuming the worst, Gerard took a ready stance, prepared to climb out of the box if he had to, but found his worries unfounded as the doors opened up to reveal a small, white corridor. The first door on the left displayed the restroom sign, and Gerard made his way in. This bathroom was a single person, unisex. It still had a rather large mirror hanging above the sink, though the glass had a small crack in its center. Fumbling into his pocket, he found the bismuth and held it up to his face. The coolness of the rock always felt soothing on his skin. Relaxing his eyes, he took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he was glaring at himself in the mirror, his gaze full of fire. "Let me tell you a story, all right? There's a guy. Let's say his name is Gerard. No, better yet. Let's say he's named Jefferson, or Malcolm, or Nelson, or $60 surcharge, any one of them. Now maybe something bad happened to this guy, right? Maybe his body did something that his mind wanted to forget, so he represses the memory and skips town. Maybe he does that. Or maybe he isn't a bad guy. Maybe something bad just happened to him and he's suffering the emotional breakdown from the fallout. Maybe that's it. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe he's a victim of circumstance. Maybe he grew up near an Indian burial ground or a nuclear waste dump and powers beyond his comprehension are screwing with his head. Or even better yet, he's a crazy person and he has no idea what is wrong with him. Maybe everything he experiences is as tangibly real as everything that another person experiences. Maybe reality and time doesn't work the same way for you as it does the person next to you. Why is he hearing screams? Oh, I bet he's delusional and he's a serial killer when he blacks out. The screams are reality breaking through. That's the big question, right? Right? That's the huge question. And yet I never find evidence. I never have to bury a body. I never have to hide from the police, and yet my mouth always tastes like copper, and I hear you narrating everything. Everything I hear crude imitations of everyone's voice, every derogative adjective used to describe what I do, every intimate, personal detail being revealed about my life, and that's all I hear. I don't even remember what it was like from before yesterday when I went to the courthouse. All I hear is you. I hear you telling me what to do. I hear you telling me how to act. I hear you describing every last fucking detail about everything that goes on around me. And I have no say in it. I'm done. I'm going out into my car right now. I'm going to go out into the parking lot, find my car, and sleep for the first time in my life. Because it is my life. Is that what you wanted the whole time? Did you want me to go crazy and kill myself? Would that make a good story? Would that impress everyone? Go screw yourself. It isn't your story to make. It's mine. It's my life. It's my life. It's my life. With that, Gerard drew his fist back and slammed it into the mirror. The crack grew, but the mirror remained unbroken. The lights in the room flickered and shattered, raining small bits of fluorescent glass and powdered mercury on top of Gerard's head, who remained unaffected. He drew his hand back again and smashed his fist into the glass. A larger fissure formed in the mirror, but it held strong. Gerard heard a pop and felt something whiz by him, only to feel water from the faucet shoot up at him in a painfully strong stream. Undeterred by the stinging sensation on his chin, he drew his arm back one more time and smashed his closed fist into the mirror. In that one stopped moment in time, a small, microscopic rupture occurred in the mirror. This rupture caused one of the adjacent pieces of glass to give out its support and let another fall, and another fell, and another fell, and another fell, and another fell. Numerous shattered pieces of Gerard's reflection fell from the mirror, leaving it completely destroyed. And everything was dark. Christian Swanson.